It is often said that we live in an increasingly complex world. The pace of change, the degree of connectivity, and the scale of operations are leading to rapidly escalating complexity in many domains. As our industrial age of systems of organization are ending their life cycle, globalization and information technology are taking us into a much more complex world and enabling the emergence of new forms of networked organization. This transition is in turn driving a fundamental transformation in our theory and methods of management, one that goes beyond our traditional paradigm designed for dealing with relatively static, hierarchical organizations within relatively stable and predictable environments, to more complex networked organizations that are adapted to operating in a so-called VUCA world of volatility, uncertainty, and rapid change driven by innovation. This course is a first of its kind, bringing together some of the latest ideas from complexity theory and emerging approaches to the management of complex organizations. During this course, we will explore many of these new ideas, including network organizations, co-evolution, systems thinking, platform organizations, agile development, and the adaptive cycle, to name just a few. The course is broken down into 5 main sections. We will start the course off with an overview of complexity and management, talking briefly about what we mean by the practice of management before going on to take an introduction to the basic concepts from complexity theory that we will be using throughout the rest of the course, such as self-organization, networks, evolution, and systems. We will then combine our new understanding of both to take an overview to how complexity theory is being applied to management. The second section is dedicated to systems thinking. The paradigm of systems thinking is at the heart of managing complexity, as it helps us to see the whole and not simply the parts, a key requirement for understanding and managing these highly interconnected and interdependent systems. We firstly give an overview of systems thinking before going on to talk about the key concept of emergence and exploring the system dynamics modeling framework that helps us to understand the nonlinear feedback loops that drive change in complex organizations. Networked organizations. In the next section, we explore this new type of networked organization that we see emerging in post-industrial economies. New types of platform organizations that go beyond the industrial age model. Enabled by information technology, they are networked in structure, collaborative by nature, open, and self-organizing. In this section, we explore the DNA of these new forms of organization, contrasting them with our more traditional form to understand their key attributes. In the fourth section to the course, we will see how a very different approach to our traditional linear project management methods are needed when projects reach a high degree of complexity. We will look at so-called wicked problems, a new breed of very complex challenges such as climate change, inequality, or cybersecurity, all of which share the key characteristics of complexity. We will look at the methods presented by complexity management designed for managing these large projects under volatile and uncertain conditions. The net result of the complex environment that we explored in the previous section is what the business world calls VUCA. VUCA is an acronym for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. It captures the most salient challenges faced by leaders operating in complex environments. In this last section, we introduce the concept of VUCA and give an overview of strategies for navigating these challenging environments through the development of adaptive and agile organizations. This course is designed as an introduction to the subject. Concepts are explored in non-technical terms, and it will require only a basic background knowledge of management and economics. The course should be relevant for those engaged in all areas of management, both public and private.
Complexity management is an alternative approach or paradigm to our more traditional management methods. Thus, it might be of value to us to start off by discussing what we mean by management in general, before we go on to talk about different approaches to it in later modules. Management, in its most general sense, is a very fundamental human activity. In its most basic sense, we can understand management as being about organization. That is to say, it is the activity of organizing or arranging things so as to achieve some desired functional outcome. As such, management is a pervasive activity that we're all engaged in almost all of the time. When we get up in the morning, we manage our appearance, choosing what clothes to wear in order to project a certain image. We manage our house by organizing the different elements so as to achieve the desired functionality of a living space. We organize our time so as to achieve something in the day. In all of these cases, we have a set of elements and we're trying to arrange them in order to achieve some desired outcome. This is the same on the micro level of organizing ourselves as it is on the macro level of managing an entire organization, such as a mayor managing a city, or for the management of a production process, a business, or a country. So this is the idea of management within the most generalized sense, but when we talk about management in the professional sense, we understand the term management in a more narrow context. That is to say, we understand it to mean the management of an organization of people towards performing some collective function in order to achieve some desired outcome. So management then is of course not a static event, it is a process, and we can think about a number of stages or activities within that process. We need to firstly understand and create some model to the system we wish to manage and the environment within which it operates. We need to bring people together and define some system to coordinate their activities towards the desired end. And this organization of people needs processes and procedures that enable it to execute on projects. And finally, the organization needs to be able to adapt and respond to the changing circumstances within its environment. So firstly then, we need some kind of model to the system we wish to manage. You can't begin to try and manage something if you don't know whatever it is you wish to manage. In order to manage something, we have to understand the system to some extent, and knowing the system means building up a model to it. If we want to manage something, we have to have experience of that system, and it's through that experience that we learn how the organization behaves. The first time we get on a bike and try to manage to cycle, we fall off, because we don't really understand how that system behaves. If you were sent in to manage a busy restaurant tomorrow without any experience of it, the outcome would be almost certainly a failure, because you have no model for how that system operates. But if you've been working in that restaurant for 10 years or so, you would have over that time gained the experience required to build up a model of how it functions and thus become capable of managing it. Because whatever it is we're trying to manage does not exist in isolation, we have to have both a model of the system and its environment. A business needs to know about the industry they're in, or a government needs to know about the international political environment within which it operates. Finally, the model has to be as complex as the system that you're trying to manage. This is what is called requisite variety. Next, the process of management involves the organizing of people into a functional unit. In order to have an effective organization, we need to integrate and coordinate a set of people with different capabilities. Both of these terms, integration and differentiation, are important. Integration means they are working together. Differentiation means they are doing different things. Without either of these, we don't really have an organization. If everyone performs different functions, but they are not coordinated, we don't have an organization. Likewise, if everyone performs exactly the same function, again, we don't really have an organization. The organization is in how we arrange different functional capabilities in order for them to work together. It is only when we're able to do that that we get something that is more than simply the sum of its parts, and thus we actually get an organization and not simply a set of people. And thus we can say trying to create systems that enable different people to work together constructively is a central activity to the profession of management. How well the organization achieves in doing this is central to its success and overall functionality. For example, if we take two economies like that of Germany and Peru, we might ask, how is Germany capable of producing all sorts of complex products and services, sophisticated chemicals, manufacture aeroplanes, produce advanced financial services, etc. But the Peruvian economy is not capable of producing many of these things. If we look closely, we will see that within the German economy, there are very many people who know how to do a very many different specialized functions, whilst also they have very many large public and private organizations capable of coordinating all these diverse activities towards producing these complex products. While the Peruvian economy lacks both this wide variety and abundance of different occupations and many of the institutions required to successfully coordinate them. Why and how we get people to come together and coordinate their activities will be a defining factor in the makeup to the organization, and we will be discussing different managerial approaches to trying to achieve this in coming modules. We've been largely talking about the internal structure and workings to the organization, but at the end of the day, this organization needs to perform some function within its environment. That is to say, deliver some outcome in the form of a good or service that is of value, and this can be defined as the system's operations. As such, we can understand operations as another distinct activity of management. According to Wikipedia, operations management is an area of management concerned with designing and controlling the process of production and redesigning business operations in the production of goods or services. Thus, the function of operations management is to execute on the organization's projects, and this will require the designing, implementing, and monitoring of a set of processes and procedures to facilitate production of some kind. Organizations are dynamic entities subject to internal and external change, and in order to persist over time, they have to be able to navigate this changing environment. The organization needs to be able to define long-term, desirable objectives and be capable of adapting to changes within its environment. This is what we call strategic management. It requires business intelligence and decision-making capabilities. Within a typical corporation, this is the function of the C-level suite of executives, who are expected to have a full overview of the internal workings to the organization and have a broad understanding of the industry they're operating in and a long-term vision as to what is the best general direction for the organization to go in order for it to develop and grow over time. Strategic management is the awareness, intelligence, and leadership of the organization. This, of course, doesn't necessarily have to be at the top of some hierarchy. The organization may become corrupted, in which case those in positions of leadership are no longer aware of the organization or environment, or for some other reason do not act in the long-term interests of that organization. Thus, leadership can come from any position. It can be anyone in the organization that is aware of how the organization works and takes leadership by acting in a way that is in the best interest of that organization in that environment, irrespective of how others may act. Strategic leaders need to define what is the function or desired state of the system and be able to ascribe some metric to that in order to be able to receive information about the system and its state with respect to its objectives. In this module, we've tried to outline a basic definition to what we mean by the practice of management, which we talked about as the activity of organizing or arranging people or things so as to achieve some desired function and outcome. We then went on to outline some of the basic functions involved in the profession of management, including firstly needing some kind of model to the system we wish to manage, noting that in order to manage something, we have to actually know that organization's structure and behavior, which means building up some kind of model to it. We talked about how management involves the organizing of people into a functional unit, requiring us to integrate and coordinate a set of individuals with different capabilities. We talked about operations as another central activity, requiring the management of projects through which the organization executes in the production of some product or service. Finally, we looked at the need for the strategic management required for the leadership of the organization in defining and pursuing long-term desired objectives. Complexity management may be defined simply as the management of complex systems. So before we can go any further, we really need to give some outline as to what exactly a complex system is. In this video, we'll be trying to give a clear outline to the difference between a simple linear system and a complex system. Firstly, complex systems are a type of system. A system is simply a set of things that are interdependent in performing some collective function. So the human body is a system in that it consists of many individual organs that work together as a functioning entirety. A business is another example of a system, many different individuals and departments functioning as an integrated unit to collectively produce some set of products or services. And of course, there are many other examples of systems, such as transportation systems, ecosystems, information systems, and so on. Not everything is a system though. If we take a random collection of things, say a hard drive, a light, and a watch, and put them together, this is not a system. It is simply a set of elements because they are not interconnected and interdependent in performing some collective function. It is because of the fact that the elements within a system perform some combined function that systems are said to be greater than the sum of their parts. That is to say that the system as a whole has properties and functionality that none of its constituent elements possess. A plant cell would be an example of this. It is composed of many inanimate molecules, but when we put these together, we get a biological cell that has the properties of a living system. So it is not any of the elements that have the property of life, but it is the particular way that we arrange these molecules that gives rise to this emergent property of the living system as an entirety. So that's a very quick overview to the idea of a system. But systems can be defined as either simple linear systems or complex nonlinear systems. We classify them as such because each have very different properties and behavior, and thus how we approach trying to study, design, or manage them changes fundamentally. All systems start out simple and they evolve to become complex. Systems have a number of properties that make them more or less complex. These include the number of elements within the system, the level of interdependence between elements, the degree of connectivity between those parts, and their degree of autonomy and diversity. Turning these properties to the system up or down makes the system more or less complex. So we'll go over each of these in more detail. Firstly, the number of elements within our system. This is quite straightforward. The more parts there are to our organization, the more complex it will be. In true complex systems, the number of elements is, for all intensive purposes, virtually infinite. Think of the number of devices within a city. It is so many that we could not itemize them. Linear systems consist of a limited, finite amount of components where it is possible to know and itemize each element in the system, making it possible to define a closed system and say what is part of that organization and what is not. With complex systems, we typically cannot do this, and this is part of what makes them open systems instead of closed systems, where we can never fully know and understand all of the parts and all of the interactions, with the internet or financial markets being a good example of this. Secondly, interdependence. Linear systems have a limited amount of elements interacting in a well-defined linear fashion, meaning cause and effect are directly related. If I hit a ball with a bat, it will move off in the opposite direction, and that is linear causality. It is very simple and intuitive to us. We are programmed to look for and try and understand the world through simple cause and effect interactions like this, and this works well when dealing with simple systems. But as we turn up the interdependency between the parts, this linear causality starts to break down. Interdependency means the way we put things together and what we put together matters. Like putting two chemical substances together, depending on which ones they are, we may get very different outcomes. They may work together, giving us an outcome much greater than we'd expect, or they may have no effect on each other at all. Coupled to this, events may be interdependent over time, as they feed back on themselves to have a compounding effect over time, like compound interest acting on a bank account. The result can be exponential growth or decay, and things can change very rapidly. With these feedback loops, small events can get amplified into large systemic effects, and this is part of the idea of the butterfly effect and chaos theory. Next, the degree of connectivity is another primary factor. Complex systems are known to be highly interconnected. This is why they are typically modeled as networks that captures the structure of this connectivity. Linear systems have a low level of interconnectivity between their parts, and thus we define them in terms of these isolated parts and their properties. In these highly interconnected systems, such as the Internet or global air transportation system, it is the structure of the network that comes to define the system. That is to say, what is connected to what and where you lie in the network. Are you a central hub like London in the financial markets, or on the periphery of the network? What is flowing on the network? How evenly is the connectivity distributed out? And many other questions relating to the structure of the connections. Connectivity and access are central to understanding complex systems, and network theory is the language through which we do this. Lastly, complexity is also a product of the degree of autonomy and the capacity for adaptation of the elements within the organization, and a corollary to this is diversity. When all the elements within our system are very similar or homogeneous, then it is much simpler to model, design or manage, as opposed to dealing with a heterogeneous organization composed of many diverse parts, each with their own unique set of properties. When the elements have a very low level of autonomy and diversity, then the system can be designed, managed and controlled centrally in a top-down fashion. But as we increase the autonomy of the elements within the system, this becomes no longer possible, as control and organization become distributed out, and it is now the interactions on the local level that comes to define how the system develops. And this gives rise to an important feature of complex systems, that is self-organization. When elements have the autonomy to adapt locally, they can self-organize to form global patterns of organization. The process through which this takes place may be called emergence. Thus, as opposed to simple linear systems where order typically comes from some top-down centralized coordination, patterns of order within complex systems emerge in a distributed fashion from the bottom up. In this video, we've been briefly laying down a working definition for what a complex system is. We defined it as a system composed of multiple interdependent parts that are highly interconnected and capable of autonomous adaptation. To cite a few more examples, we might think of financial markets with lots of different highly interconnected traders adapting to each other's behavior as they interact through buying and selling securities. Or an ecosystem with multiple different species that are all interdependent and adapting to each other and their environment. Another example will be a supply chain network with many different products and distributors interacting and adapting to each other in order to deliver a product. And there are many more examples of complex systems, such as transportation networks, cities, the human brain, the weather, and many types of social organizations. In this video, we'll be giving a high-level overview to the domain of complexity management, all of which we'll be going over in more detail in coming videos. We can understand complexity management as the application of complexity theory to the practice of management. Thus, it draws upon the key insights and ideas from complexity science and uses them to try and help us manage complex organizations. Examples of these complex organizations might be cities, international politics, multinational corporations, global logistics networks, or healthcare systems. These are all complex organizations due to their nature of having many parts that are highly interconnected, interdependent, and autonomous. We can, and often do, go on using our traditional industrial age management approach to try and manage these organizations. But as we'll be discussing in a future module, the basic principles underlining our traditional management approach were designed for dealing with relatively simple systems. That is, organizations that have a limited number of components that interact in a simple, linear fashion at a low level of interconnectivity and where we can constrain those components. A factory would be a classical example of this, and it should not be surprising that the industrial age management approach was designed to manage relatively simple, closed systems like factories, because that was exactly what we had to do 100 or 200 years ago when this approach was first formalized. But today, in post-industrial economies, managing factories, as important as it is really the least of our concerns. We face much more complex challenges, such as trying to get our healthcare systems working, enabling effective forms of governance, or achieving collaboration between companies across large supply chains. These are all very different forms of organization that represent a different set of challenges and require a more complex approach to management that is aligned with their core attributes. And we already see lots of innovation in management theory to meet this. We've seen the rise of a new set of ideas around agile and lean organizations, many different ideas around flipping the hierarchy upside down, creating networked organizations, and lots of innovation in enabling more collaborative forms of organization. But most of these new management theories can be best understood within the context of complexity theory, as they all fit within the complexity framework. And we'll use the rest of this video to outline what that framework is. That is to say, the key concepts within complexity theory and how they apply to management. Although complexity theory consists of a whole zoo of new ideas, we'll structure it around a few central concepts, namely systems thinking, non-linearity, networks, and adaptation and evolution. Firstly, complexity management is based on the systems thinking paradigm that we'll be discussing in a coming module. Put simply, systems theory or systems thinking is a holistic way of looking at the world. This paradigm posits that the parts to a system can only be properly understood and thus managed when taken in relation to the whole system. Whereas our traditional analytical approach takes a system and breaks it down, focusing on the individual parts of the organization. Systems thinking looks instead at the relationship between the parts and the context or environment within which something exists. Whereas our traditional analytical approach is very much focused on closed, well-bounded organizations, systems theory is instead looking more at open systems. That is to say, organizations that have so much interaction and exchange with their environment that we cannot model them as closed systems. And this is the nature of complex organizations. They are really open networks instead of closed, well-bounded formal organizations. Think about a healthcare system. It is a complex network of many different organizations and individuals, from primary care practitioners to hospital administration to government agencies to universities and so on. All of them are interdependent in affecting the outcome to the system, and the boundaries are fuzzy and even non-existent. For example, would we include the food companies in this organization, as what they produce clearly has a direct impact on people's health? Would we include the clean air lobby group, as air quality would also have an effect on people's health? Another example would be global supply chains, where we have to get many independent organizations across the value network to collaborate for the whole supply chain to function effectively. This supply chain has no real boundaries to it, and no one is in control of the whole organization. The same would be true for international politics and many other forms of complex organizations. This is the nature of complex organizations. There is no real boundary to them, and this makes them quite different in nature to our traditional well-bounded organizations. Because they have no real boundary, it is more relevant to talk about them as systems or networks of connections. So the question is then, how do we actually manage this form of open organization when we don't really have control over the members, but still they are interdependent and we need to get a functioning global outcome from the system for the end user? The primary problem being that our traditional reductionist approach is predicated upon actually being able to directly itemize and control the members of the organization. Our traditional approach works by creating a boundary around the organization and a hierarchy within the organization, where top management then decide what is best for the entire organization, and the members are constrained and coordinated towards that predefined outcome. And in such a way, we get global coordination. Suffice to say, this does not work in open organizations. Global, macro-level patterns in complex systems are emergent phenomena of local-level interactions that give rise to self-organization. Thus, instead of directly aligning the actions of the members towards the desired global outcome, we instead create the context or platform within which the members can interact so as to coordinate locally, and then out of this we will get the emergence of some global organization. For managers, this means creating the context that facilitates the process of self-organization to take place. We can't directly control the outcome to the system, but we can influence the initial conditions. We can do this by creating a conducive context that represents an attractor towards coordination and cooperation between the members. The big idea here is that of collaboration. We no longer have control, but we can enable the context and conditions for collaboration to emerge. Next, we'll talk about non-linearity and interdependency, which are key concepts within systems and complexity theory. As we turn up the connectivity, the parts of the organization become more interdependent, and this is something we're currently witnessing around the world with the rise of IT and globalization. Interdependence creates non-linearity. When we put two or more things together and they become interdependent, they can work together constructively, or inversely, they can counteract each other, creating a combined organization that is more or less than the sum of its parts. 1 and 1 stops adding up to 2, and linear thinking starts to break down. It should come as no surprise to you when I say our traditional management methods are very much based upon linear thinking. We look for linear cause and effect interactions to describe events, and in reality we will often go on using simple cause and effect descriptions of events even when they aren't really working, simply so that we don't have to deal with the complexity behind the situation. We go on talking about GDP when we all know this is a very blunt linear metric that hides the complex set of interacting variables to a society's overall quality of life. We go on looking at maps of the world divided up into nation states when this simple linear model hides the much more complex set of networks that make up our global economy and society. Linear thinking works well in simple environments, and it is a necessary competency to being an effective manager, but it's not sufficed. In complex environments, we need to be able to recognize that it can blind us in dealing with the real dynamics to the situation, and thus in such situations be prepared to switch to a more complex, non-linear form of reasoning. Complexity management would posit that most complex phenomena that we encounter are the product of a number of different variables interacting in a specific non-linear fashion, where they are amplified. Or anything, it is about accepting that not all things are simple. Some things are, but some things are truly complex, and trying to treat them as if they're not does not change the situation. You really have to roll up your sleeves and dig into all the specific interacting parts, and also understand the system as a whole. This is the only way you really solve difficult problems. There is no silver bullet, but on the other hand, if you do actually understand how things work and you are prepared to do all the hard work, then complexity theory does provide us with a framework that actually makes it possible to solve problems that otherwise would appear virtually impossible. Next, network theory is another central part of complexity science, as it deals with the highly interconnected architecture of real-world complex systems, such as transportation networks, financial markets, or ecosystems. With the rise of the internet, we're seeing the birth of new forms of networked organizations and the so-called access economy. Open platforms like Airbnb, the App Store, Uber, and many others have shot to fame, taking over or creating whole new industries. The networked platform model is proving highly scalable, and they're currently disrupting many industries. With the reduction in transaction costs that IT enables, these networked organizations are able to harness new value sources and access whole new markets that were previously not possible within closed formal organizations, whose costs of coordination were too high to reach out to the mass of people. These network platforms are instead able to harness the small but combined vast productive capability of the so-called crowd or long tail. The mass of people that were previously not productive enough to organize formally are now able to set up their own networks of collaboration, and out of this we're seeing a new mode of production within society, sometimes called peer production or mass collaboration, classical examples being Wikipedia or the Linux Foundation, a much more dynamic and swarm-like form of organization. The access economy is a major paradigm shift from ownership of products to access of services. In the same way that hyperconnectivity is unlocking a vast amount of untapped productivity of the crowd on the long tail, it also has the potential to do the same to virtually every product around us. We can think about all the products around us as both things and the function they perform. The industrial economic model was all about ownership of things. That monolithic ownership worked to lock up the functionality of the product, meaning that the function was only accessed a fraction of the time. A good example being the typical car that is used on average less than 5% of the time. With the reduction in transaction costs and the proliferation of networks, we can now think of products as services and economies not as being about the buying and selling of products, but instead about the access to value. This access economy requires us to change our management approach, to think in terms of access, connectivity, and networks, and network theory gives us the language to do that. Finally, we'll talk about adaptation and evolution. With fast-paced technology innovation, globalization, and changes in our supporting ecosystem, the post-industrial world is no longer the stable, predictable environment that it once might have been. It is marked by what business leaders call VUCA, which stands for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. Our traditional centralized organizations are normalized for stable and predictable environments, and they are inept at dealing with fast-paced change or non-linear radical events. But fast-paced change and radical events are becoming the new norm as the world becomes more interconnected and dynamic. And this is congruent with what complexity theory tells us about the capacity for nonlinear systems to generate black swan events and the butterfly effect. As we see more indicators becoming exponential, we also see a shift from normal distributions to long-tail distributions that generate many more events that are several standard deviations from the norm, such as financial crisis or extreme weather phenomena. We currently see a lot of creative destruction as companies in the S&P 500 are lasting shorter and shorter periods of time. The primary focus of organizations within this disruptive environment should be survival through building adaptive capacity to enable their evolution. This VUCA world requires a recalibration of many dimensions to our approach to management. A fundamental shift from resisting change to adapting to it. This requires a new set of capabilities surrounding adaptive capacity, the capacity for the organization to evolve new solutions in response to their changing environment. Adaptation involves a recognition to uncertainty, that is to say that we cannot fully know future outcomes. This idea of uncertainty runs very much contrary to our traditional management approach. In fact, it is so alien that in economics we typically call it radical uncertainty. But what we call radical uncertainty is just normal old uncertainty. It just looks radical because our standard analytical approach leads us to think that the future should be knowable. We conceive of the future in terms of some linear transformation of the past, what is called ergodicity. We take a sample from the past and use it to compute future outcome probabilities. Most of our business analysis, and particularly our financial analysis, is dependent upon this idea of ergodicity, that the future is knowable. But when things become more non-linear and complex, ergodicity doesn't really hold. As the system evolves, we get non-linear interactions between events that have not even emerged yet. For example, try turning the clock back 20 or 30 years and predicting how the internet would unfold, how we would get the emergence of smartphones that would give rise to the app economy, that would enable big data and all the future possibilities that will emerge out of that. This is not really possible because of all the non-linear interactions and the emergent evolutionary dynamics to the system's development. In such a case, our strategy needs to change from one of trying to predict the future to adapting to it as it unfolds. Adaptation means being open to uncertainty and maintaining a diversity of states in order to be able to respond to a variety of possible outcomes that are as yet unknown. It requires an evolutionary approach that involves experimenting, testing, and rapid iteration. In a word, it requires business agility, agile organizations, and we're currently seeing how the idea of enterprise agility has gone from nowhere to being identified as one of the few top-level strategic enterprise capabilities. And we'll be discussing agility and evolution in the final section to the course as we talk about the VUCA framework. In this module, we've been giving a brief overview to the area of complexity management, whilst also trying to weave in a discussion around the fundamental transformations taking place within our economy in order to illustrate the relevance of this alternative paradigm to the current unfolding economic context. We firstly talked about systems thinking that offers us a new approach to managing open organizations that reduces our dependency on closed hierarchical management structures by instead focusing on the process of self-organization and emergent outcomes. We looked at non-linearity as a key characteristic of complex organizations, where many factors are interdependent, working in a synergistic fashion. We then went on to talk about how networked organizations can harness the productive capabilities of the crowd in the growing access economy, where value is no longer interpreted in terms of products, but instead in terms of access to services, and how our management approach has to equally shift to focus on access and connectivity. Finally, we briefly touched upon the idea of adaptation and evolution, as business agility is becoming a central concern within the context of the 21st century VUCA environment. As we previously touched upon, complexity management is an alternative paradigm to our traditional management approach. If we're going to manage something, we're going to have some representation or model to how that system works. A paradigm is the fundamental conceptual framework or model we use for interpreting events. In science, there is fundamentally just two different paradigms or processes of reasoning. These two different approaches to modeling are called analysis and synthesis. Analysis is the standard process of reasoning used within mainstream science, management, and engineering, while synthesis is typically seen as an alternative, and it forms the foundations to what we call systems thinking. With the process of analysis, we build a model of something by focusing on that system, decomposing it to understand its constituent parts, the simple interaction between those elements, and then we form an account of the whole in terms of the properties of these parts. And the process of doing this is called reductionism, because we're reducing the system to its most elementary parts. This is the standard approach taken within modern science, and it is why, when we think about science, we think about things like atoms, molecules, and people in labs that are isolating things and taking them apart to understand their properties in isolation. Synthesis, in contrast to analysis, is the process of reasoning whereby we try to understand something not by taking it apart, but instead we try to look at the system in relation to its environment. So here, we're reasoning upwards instead of downwards. We're building up a model of the system by understanding its connections to other things within its environment, and looking at the function or role that it plays within that network of connections that makes up the overall context or environment. So for example, instead of trying to understand something like a bird by taking it into the lab and dissecting it to understand its anatomy, here we would instead go out and look at the bird within its native environment, trying to understand its place and function within the ecosystem as a whole. So whereas analysis is characterized by the approach of reductionism, synthesis is characterized by being holistic. We're always referring to the whole context or environment in order to create a model of the system we're interested in. Both synthesis and analysis are equally valid processes of reasoning. We use them both all day, every day. When we go to buy a car, we think about the properties of that car in isolation, its fuel consumption, the quality of its tires, the interior, etc. But also we think about how well it is suited to the context within which it will be used. Will we be driving it in a city or the country? Does my wife have a similar car or not, etc. In order to properly build up a model of something, we really need to use both processes of reasoning. We typically call synthesis and systems thinking an alternative approach because the modern era has been characterized by a dominance of the analytical scientific approach. For approximately the past 500 years, since the scientific revolution and the work of Galileo, Newton and others, the reductionist approach has been the mainstream approach to modeling and interpreting our world. As such, it has formed the backbone of modern society's collective body of knowledge. And during the Industrial Revolution, this body of scientific knowledge was applied to creating a more formal management approach, what we call scientific management. The Industrial Revolution and the arrival of mass society necessitated a whole new approach to management as it became increasingly professionalized and specialized in response to having to deal with larger and more complicated forms of organization, such as the modern nation-state and large corporations. Scientific management was an early management theory to come out of this period and gained widespread acceptance in analyzing and improving business organizations and the workflows in factories. Scientific management is based upon the work of Frederick Taylor, who laid down the fundamental principles of large-scale manufacturing through the assembly line. It emphasizes rationalization and standardization of work through the division of labor. Frederick Taylor looked at each step of production, breaking those steps down into sub-steps, and recording exactly how much time and how much motion was necessary to complete each task. By reducing the amount of motion, the worker could get more done and productivity was increased. It was an idea that fitted perfectly with industrial age mechanization. This approach to managing organizations that was born out of the industrial age has gone on to be applied to all areas of organization, and it remains the default approach that we inherit today. So we'll quickly consider some of its advantages and disadvantages. Firstly, reductionism breaks systems down into their individual parts and focuses upon those well-defined components. So within management, this involves the division of an organization or process into categories, departments, or stages. By doing this, we create component parts that can be easily isolated and measured. By breaking a process up in this way, we're able to isolate the organization's components sufficiently to identify simple linear interactions of cause and effect. We can then use these simple cause and effect interactions to influence or control how the components function. We can measure their efficiency and control the outputs by manipulating inputs. By using this method, we can divide up a complex system like a large corporation into relatively simple components that can be measured, controlled, and thus managed. This breaking down of the system into individual components then inevitably requires at some stage for us to put all the parts back together so as to achieve the end product or result. In order to achieve this, traditional organizations build up a hierarchical pyramid, right at the top of which is one or a small group of elements that are responsible for integrating the whole system. Below this are a small set of positions responsible for managing and integrating the primary domains of the organization, and further down more people are responsible for more specialized areas, and so on until we get to the front lines of the organization. Each level is responsible for the integration of the different set of functions beneath it. In this way, the organization can be coordinated from one centralized position. All components can be controlled through a direct line of command and measured through a well-defined set of metrics relevant to their domain. This model to the industrial organization was developed in response to a particular environment that required the large-scale mass production of standardized products and services in a stable and predictable fashion. Within this context, the industrial model for organization has, in many ways, proved itself highly successful, but faced with the changing environment of the 21st century, its limitations are becoming increasingly clear to us. Complexity management is based upon this alternative paradigm of synthesis that gives us a very different model to organizations and how to manage them. Being holistic, it is focused on the whole instead of the parts. It is primarily focused on the whole functionality of the organization, positing that this is an emergent phenomena, that is to say, the whole organization is something more than the sum of its parts. From this perspective, it is the particular way that the parts are interrelated that gives rise to this added value, the emergent global functionality, and it is this emergent functionality of the organization that we're really interested in. Thus, we're not particularly interested in any part of the organization, but instead how those parts are arranged or organized into a functional unit. Instead of focusing on the components of the organization, we focus instead on the connections. That is to say that we do not try to achieve the desired outcome by defining component parts and trying to control those parts through a hierarchy. We instead create the connections, the context within which those components interact, and out of that we get the emergence of the global functionality to the organization. So these are two very different approaches. With the standard approach, we're essentially trying to manage and control the output to the system. Within this approach, management defines and specifies to the organization what they want the outcome to be. This is why it's seen to be top-down in nature, because management are constraining the elements to the organization towards the desired outcome. In contrary, the complexity approach does not seek to control or even define the desired outcome. Instead, it is focused on creating the right context that will enable the elements in the organization to self-organize into a functional unit, out of which emerges the desired global outcome to the organization. This approach is essentially a creative one. Your capacity as a manager to influence the system is only really in your capacity to create the input context. You don't really get to control the outcome. We will expand upon this further in coming modules, but emergence is fundamentally a process of creation. Leading or managing an organization within this paradigm means creating the future context instead of trying to control based upon past information. In this section, we've been looking at the foundations to complexity management by talking about two different paradigms, synthesis and analysis, where analysis involves modeling something in terms of its constituent parts and their linear interactions, while synthesis takes a holistic approach, modeling the system in terms of its relations and functioning within its whole environment. We then went on to talk about these two different paradigms as applied to the activity of management, firstly looking at our traditional analytical approach to management and some of its key features, including the reduction of complex organizations to simple components that could be measured, management as the control of the linear interactions of cause and effect that govern these components, and the use of hierarchical structure and incentive systems as a means for integrating and coordinating the overall organization. Finally, we gave an outline to systems thinking management that is concerned with the emergent functionality of the organization and tries to achieve this by creating the context that will facilitate self-organization amongst the organization's members. In the previous module, we touched upon the idea of emergence, which is for many the central idea within systems theory. Our whole conception of organization and the profession of management is built around the idea of a hierarchy within organizations through which control is exercised in a downward fashion in order to coordinate the individual's actions towards some desired outcome. This approach may work well within relatively stable environments. After all, this form of management has created the industrial economies we live in today. But unfortunately, it is not designed for more complex environments. So let's firstly briefly outline some of the limitations to our standard approach to management. Firstly, reductionism focuses on the static components of the organization and the metrics we apply to evaluating them. In so doing, it systematically diminishes the space around and between them that is not measured. Thus, the system can become reduced to a simple set of metrics that are depleting some resource that may be more difficult to quantify, but is equally required to maintain the system in the long term. A good example of this is the failure of our metrics for economic growth to incorporate the natural resources they depend upon. A net result of this is a short-term profit at a long-term expense, making the system unsustainable. Secondly, inherent in the command and control paradigm is the idea that a person or few people in charge give the solution that is the only solution to other people who are in charge of implementing it. Thus, the organization becomes heavily dependent upon the limited cognitive and information processing capabilities of a few individuals at the top of the hierarchy. This also reduces the capacity for the majority of the organization's members to take initiative, act autonomously, and respond to local information. Lastly, the reductionist model to organization is built on the axiom of a relatively static system in a relatively static environment. The primary focus of this form of organization is to remove surprise, to dampen down change, and keep an organization moving stably through time according to the prior intentions of its members. All of these features mean that these systems are invariably resistant to change, innovation and evolution, and thus inept at dealing with dynamic and volatile environments. The standard approach is a linear model. It gives us exactly what we expect. By constraining the members, we reduce their autonomous engagement. The result is inevitably that we get business as usual. We're very unlikely to get exceptional results because the members are not fully engaged. Because of this model is well suited to normal circumstances, but is not designed for dealing with exceptional circumstances. Emergence is the process whereby new phenomena are created as we combine things together. Our global economy is a good example of emergence. Through all of the systems of organization, we can collectively produce things like aeroplanes and laptop computers that none of us could produce if we all acted independently. These things are emergent phenomena of the way the parts are arranged. And this is part of Adam Smith's insight that even though all the members of the society may be acting in their own self-interest, we can get globally beneficial outcomes. We can also call this noise pollution. Might be an example of this. Two people talking at the same time doesn't make the conversation twice as good, as they are interacting in a destructive fashion. We get the emergence of an effective organization through positive synergies, which involve people differentiating their activities while also coordinating them within some combined process. And this is the essence of a functional, complex organization. They manage to differentiate and coordinate many parts, and out of that we get powerful emergence that makes the whole truly different from its parts. Like a swarm of bees or an ant colony, both of which are vastly more sophisticated than the simple components that make them up. So from the complexity perspective, management of an organization is really about creating a context within which we can get these positive synergies to happen, and we do that by creating an attractor towards behavior that has positive externalities. For example, if we think about the failures of our healthcare systems, now no one wants to get obese, and no country wants to spend 10% of their GDP on healthcare. This is in many ways an emergent phenomena of micro-level negative externalities of people eating unhealthy food, lack of exercise, etc. Now if we wanted to try and change this outcome, we don't go into the top management and declare some new regulation. Instead, we look at the context within which the members of the organization are acting and how, because of the local incentives they're under, we get this emergent, dysfunctional global outcome. We ask, how can we make choosing the salad an easier option than choosing the Big Mac and fries? Or how do we create more greenways that might incentivize people to walk instead of taking their cars? These are examples of attractors that are specifically designed to create a context within which choosing an action that has a positive externality is simply easier and more attractive than choosing one that has a negative externality. And in this way we get synergies and the emergence of the desired outcome on the macro level, whereas simple systems are nothing more than the sum of their parts. All complex forms of organization have two or more qualitatively different levels of organization to them. The macro level is qualitatively different from the micro level, and with complexity management, we don't try to directly affect the macro level. We try to alter it by affecting the local context within which the actors in the system are making their choices. And this helps to illustrate another important idea within complexity management, that of obliquity. Obliquity means not explicit or directly to the desired point. For example, in trying to land a rocket on the moon, one would direct it slightly off from the most direct line and let the gravity of the moon catch it and bring it in to the desired final point. Because complex systems are non-linear, meaning there is no direct cause and effect, the outcomes to the system are an emergent phenomena. We cannot directly affect them, but instead we have to aim around the phenomena that we wish to affect. We have to instead focus on the components' interactions that are giving rise to this emergent outcome. That is to say, we have to take an oblique approach to solving the problem. Mark Anderson, a previous manager at Trader Joe's, illustrates this phenomena when he writes, quote, "One of the key things I took away from my experience as store manager at Trader Joe's was just how much the bottom line of making money was enhanced when you focus on treating employees and customers well. At the end of the day, Trader Joe's makes a lot of money, but they do so not by focusing on making as much money as they can, but rather by seeking to provide the best service and products possible. He goes on to write, although I haven't termed it obliquity until now, I've advocated a similar focus for public schools. Rather than focus on the bottom line of student test scores, we need to focus on the content taught and the learning environment of the school. And by focusing on these things, test scores will naturally be enhanced. We can see clearly the idea of emergence here. Instead of focusing on the direct outcome, he's talking about using an oblique method of creating the context for these desired outcomes to emerge. Efforts to impose linear thinking on complex situations have often led to the opposite of what was intended, where explicit articulation of a goal will result in the complex environment pushing back in the opposite direction. As a result, the principle of obliquity becomes relevant. In such situations, oblique goals will often be more effective. For example, the goal of delighting customers may make more money than an explicit, direct goal of simply trying to make money. Another classical example of this is happiness. We all wish to have some happiness and quality of life, but if we focus too much directly on this outcome, it often, in the long run, leads to the opposite result. Quality of life is again a complex emergent phenomena. It is not something that can be directly achieved. In this video, we've been talking about the idea of emergence, a central topic within systems theory. How, through the synergistic interaction of the individuals within the organization, we get the emergence of global behavior and structure that is qualitatively different from that of the micro level. We talked about positive and negative synergies that can give rise to novel, desirable outcomes or unintended consequences. We discussed how we do not try to directly control and affect the macro level of the system, but instead use an oblique approach, look at the non-linear local interactions that are creating that behavior and try to alter the context within which those choices are made. As we previously discussed, the emphasis within the systems and complexity paradigm is on local interactions and how these give rise to the emergent macro-level phenomena of the state of the whole system. Systems dynamics is one modeling language used in the management of large, complex systems in order to try and capture and model these local causal links and how their interaction over time gives rise to long-term patterns of behavior. Systems dynamics is a methodology and mathematical modeling technique for framing, understanding, and discussing complex issues and problems. Originally developed in the 1950s to help managers improve their understanding of industrial processes, it is now being used throughout the public and private sector for dealing with large, complex projects such as macroeconomic analysis, military interventions, or environmental policy modeling. Systems dynamics is again a holistic approach in nature. In our analysis, we often focus on discrete events, like watching the news every night, where the presenter simply describes what happened. But of course, if we really want to understand something, like why a dictatorship fell, or the price of biogas is going up, or why a large organization like Nokia was incapable of responding to market changes, we can't simply do this by describing what happens. We need to understand the dynamics behind these events, what is really driving the system, and this is what systems thinking is all about, trying to get behind events to see what is truly causing them. All of these complex organizations that we see have a typical behavior. We see reoccurring patterns, like the example of Nokia failing to innovate and adapt. We see this with many large organizations that are incapable of adapting to change and eventually get disrupted. These typical, reoccurring behaviors within a system are called systems archetypes. Systems archetypes are reoccurring patterns of behavior within a system. For example, we might see a child playing away happily, and then some small event happens and they start crying. The first time we see this happen, we would think that it was the small event that caused the child to cry. But if we were the child's parent and saw this pattern of behavior happening time and time again, we would start to realize that in fact, it is not so much the event itself, but some underlying dynamic that is creating this behavior. Thus, systems exhibit certain behavior, but under this is deep system structure, a set of underlying dynamics that are really driving the system, and it is these drivers that systems dynamics tries to capture. In large, complex systems, it is these dynamics that hold the system within a certain configuration or state. Therefore, it is necessary to understand these dynamics before we can try and affect the system. If we don't understand the underlying drivers and dynamics, we will likely get unintended consequences or no effect at all. Understand its dynamics, and by understanding those dynamics, you can find the leverage points that enable effective changes within that system. The basic idea of systems thinking is that of interdependence. For many people, this is what defines the idea of a system, the fact that the parts are interdependent. Therefore, every action within the organization is seen to trigger a reaction. In systems dynamics, this reaction is called feedback. In these highly interconnected systems, nothing exists in a vacuum. Every action feeds back to its source over time. The fuel exhaust coming out of your car engine may look like it simply disappears, having no effect. But this is just because you are isolating one component in a much larger system. Of course, sooner or later, all that exhaust feeds back to affect all of us drivers. And that is the nature of managing complex systems. You have to look at the whole in order to see these feedbacks that are driving them. So feedback loops describe a state of interdependency between two or more elements within a system, and there are just two types of feedback. Positive feedback, which is a self-reinforcing loop, and negative feedback, which is a balancing loop. Reinforcing feedback or amplifying feedback accelerates the given trend of a process. Positive feedback, also called reinforcing feedback or amplifying feedback, accelerates the given trend of a process. If a trend is ascending, the reinforcing positive feedback will accelerate the growth. If the trend is descending, it will accelerate the decline. For example, the falling of an avalanche is a self-reinforcing feedback process. The more material that falls, the more momentum it adds to the avalanche, thus dislodging more material, which feeds back to create greater momentum, and so on. Another example might be minority group prejudice within a society. Prejudice tends to generate discrimination against the minority, which tends to limit their opportunities, which feeds into limit their achievements, which in turn feeds back to validate the majority that the minority are not as good as them, thus once again reinforcing the chain of events. This downward spiral that may be caused by self-reinforcing feedback is called a vicious circle. But we can also have virtuous circles. For example, having a good reputation as an organization means others will talk about you favorably, which will feed back to motivate your organization to live up to that expectation and excel, which again will affect people's perception favorably, and so on. Balancing feedback or stabilizing feedback involves two or more elements that are counterbalancing each other. If we get more of one, this creates less of another, which feeds back to reduce the first. For example, the market mechanism that balances supply and demand is a negative feedback loop. If supply goes up, prices go down, which promotes more buying, which feeds back to reduce the stock, thus bringing it back to a balancing equilibrium. Maintaining your balance whilst riding a bicycle is another example of a negative feedback loop. The more you move off in one direction, the stronger you react by pulling yourself back onto course. Thus we can see how negative feedback works as a control system to maintain and regulate the organization within a set of desired parameters. Whereas positive feedback tends to lead to instability via exponential growth, oscillation or chaotic behavior, negative feedback generally promotes stability. Negative feedback tends to promote a settling towards equilibrium and reduces the effects of perturbations. Negative feedback loops in which just the right amount of correction is applied with optimal timing can be very stable, accurate, and responsive. These feedback loops then create a certain reoccurring pattern to the system as it changes over time. For example, most feedback does not occur instantly, especially when we're dealing with a large organization. There is instead a time delay. If we have a system dominated by negative feedback with time delay, we get an oscillatory pattern over time, as we have one effect that takes it in one direction, before the counterbalancing feedback gradually dampens it down and brings it back in the other direction. We might see this dynamic in the counter-cyclical fiscal policy by a government as it tries to counterbalance the business cycle. Inversely, positive reinforcing feedback loops can create a dynamic of rapid exponential growth or decay when some maximum or minimum value is reached. The so-called tragedy of the commons may be an example of this archetype. Agents use common limited resources to profit individually. As the use of the common resource is not controlled, the agents would like to continuously raise their personal benefits. The resource is therefore used more and more, and the revenue to the agents starts to decrease as the overall resource becomes depleted. The more an actor sees others overexploiting the resource, the more they are likely to intensify their activity, knowing that the collective resource will be gone soon. Agents intensify their exploitation until the resource is completely used up or seriously damaged, leading to a collapse. By the systems level, that you have the opportunity to really change things through leverage points. These leverage points are places within a complex system, such as a corporation, an economy, a city, or an ecosystem, where a small shift in the connections can produce a big change in everything. The founder of Systems Dynamics talked about complex play, the negative effect it has on their body, simply hoping that they don't get cancer. This is an open loop system with negative externalities. They are consuming the cigarette and shifting the negative effects away by denying them in some way. Now, when it comes to managing this system, instead of focusing on the parts, we try to alter this feedback loop. We might place a big graphic image or sign on the face of the cigarette packet that connects them with the consequences of their actions every time they smoke, thus trying to close the feedback loop to reduce their consumption. As another example of a counterintuitive leverage point, we could cite a recent piece of research done analyzing the social network of a company in Hungary. The analysis showed that the network had one dominant node in it which had much higher levels of connectivity than all of the senior executives. But this node was not the CEO. In fact, it was the external health practitioner who during his job got to travel around the different departments and make contact with almost all of the employees, thus serving as an important point of information exchange within the organization and a potential leverage point for changing behaviors. But ultimately, the highest leverage point in any organization is in changing the model that they use to interpret events. Changing the paradigm can change the whole organization's understanding of itself and its function, which can ultimately result in a complete transformation. As an example, we can think about the rise of the paradigm of sustainability over the past few decades. Before this change in paradigm, talking about the environment, trying to conserve nature or affect any positive environmental impact was largely a lost cause. Environmental concerns were marginalized and generally bulldozed by economic interests. But given this paradigm shift, we now see sustainability moving to central stage as it becomes a part of what organizations are and do. Sustainability is now starting to be seen as part of the marketing, value proposition, and competitive advantage of many organizations. This change in paradigm is then generating real outcomes that work and change the overall macro structure to this complex organization. As the saying goes, there's nothing as practical as a good theory. The paradigms and models an organization uses are by far the highest leverage point for affecting the overall state of the organization. In this module, we've been giving a brief overview to systems dynamics, a systems-based approach to modeling complex organizations that is focused on feedback loops and the dynamic patterns of behavior they give rise to. We talked about positive feedback as a self-reinforcing cycle of interdependency that can create virtuous or vicious cycles. Negative feedback that functions as a balancing mechanism to maintain stability and control within the system. We discussed leverage points as critical points within the organization where you can have a large systemic effect by altering the connections, information flow, models or paradigm used. There's plenty more to systems dynamics that we haven't had a chance to touch upon here, such as stock and flow diagrams. But systems dynamics is quite a popular modeling language, so there's plenty of resources out there on the web for you to dig further into it. Self-organization is one of the major themes within complex systems and a pervasive phenomenon in our world. Complex organizations like schools of fish, ant colonies, and car traffic manage to organize themselves into emergent patterns without any form of global coordination. And this is somewhat counterintuitive to our traditional assumptions, where we tend to assume that organization and order need to be imposed by some external force. But self-organization fascinates many people precisely because it is generated internally. Hurricanes, consciousness, and swarms of bees are other examples of organization emerging out of the internal interactions between the component parts of a system. Because of the adaptive capacity of human beings, whenever they interact locally, we invariably get some form of self-organization. Thus, self-organizing forms of social organization have always been there, from local markets to the formation of villages and towns. But one characteristic of the modern era has been the formation was no longer possible in the way that it was in small communities. Given the scale of the organization and the available communications tools, coordinating such large organizations was only really possible through a centralized model. A limited amount of people in the center understood and formulated plans and directions to coordinate the entire organization, with information from the local level flowing into the center and directions flowing back out. Because of economics of scale and other factors, the industrial age selectively favored these large systems of organization as they became more efficient. Small, self-organizing systems lived on, but largely as a fringe activity, as they were never able to get the scale and efficiency to compete with the centralized model, as our industrial economies became increasingly dominated by these large, formal, centralized organizations, which were, up until recently, seen as the only viable means for the effective production of value within society at scale. But today, information technology, among other factors, is fundamentally changing this dynamic. Today, we have tools and platforms for connecting people directly one-to-one or one-to-many at virtually any scale, from a small group of friends all the way up to the global level. And we can do this at a very low cost. And this is truly a game changer for organizational structure. The reality is that people now have very powerful tools in their hands, and this fundamentally shifts the power dynamic away from large organizations, which were very dominant until recently, towards the individual. This is what Gartner, the consulting company, calls the age of the consumer, and they talk about this as such, quote, "To put it simply, the age of the consumer is all about the shift in power between you and your customers. Now that shift is away from you and towards your customer. They are empowered by digital technologies, real-time access to information. With the access to education and information that many now have, and the low barriers to connect and collaborate with others, it is now very much viable for ad hoc, self-organizing systems of organization to form and compete effectively and directly with traditional centralized organizations. This was previously not possible, and it is both a radical and massive shift in power. Classical examples of this being Wikipedia that have displaced the traditional encyclopedia, or the Linux Foundation that has a larger market share running web servers and smartphones than any formal business organization. Whereas the traditional organization had relatively high overhead cost, it required an almost constant input of finance and other resources to maintain it. With the lowering of collaboration cost, it is much easier to build organizations that are more agile and less dependent on significant investment of capital. And this opens the door to harnessing social value and other motives for creating organizations that are less solely focused on financial outcomes, but also more socially engaged. And with this, we've seen the rise of the so-called social enterprise or social business. In post-industrial economies, the millennial generation are growing up in a world of relative abundance with an almost oversaturation of things, but they also inherit a world of real problems that are not so easy to ignore. And out of this mix of relative abundance, ease of collaboration, and pressing real-world problems, we see this social enterprise arise that harnesses the engagement of people along a number of dimensions. In short, due to the context that they have grown up in, millennials have a new set of expectations surrounding what work is, and they're less willing to simply fit in with the traditional model. Acquiring and retaining this talent is becoming more of a problem for traditional organizations, as they need to develop a new mentality and a more self-organizing bottom-up structure to accommodate the new working force. Whereas the traditional, centralized organization is a relatively static model, self-organization is a dynamic process that requires certain conditions. Most importantly, it requires autonomous members densely interacting locally. Autonomy is a very important ingredient here. Self-organization always comes from the bottom up. People have to be operating and driven by their own motives and agenda. And as long as they are constrained through some centralized organization, this simply can't happen. This is one reason why self-organizing systems can be more flexible and responsive, because everyone is responding locally and can act immediately to what they experience in their local environment, instead of having to send the information to some centralized authority and waiting for instructions to return before they can act. This is part of why centralized organizations are seen as more mechanical and rigid, as opposed to self-organizing systems that are more organic and fluid in nature. The autonomy of the members to act locally is a key issue. If we look at the process of self-organization within a flock of birds or school of fish, we get this emergent self-organizing pattern through each fish or bird operating under their own set of simple instructions to follow their neighbor whilst also maintaining a certain distance from them. The important thing to note here is that if you want self-organization, you have to value and respect the autonomy of the members highly. One needs to be aware that every time you impose an instruction on a member, this has a very high cost in terms of reducing the self-organizing emergent capabilities of the system. The second essential element is dense peer-to-peer interactions between the members of the organization. Interactions and information needs to be flowing horizontally, not vertically. One needs to create the conditions for connecting people locally. Dense interactions are important because all of the members may start out with divergent opinions, activities or agendas, but the more they interact, the greater the requirement to coordinate their steps. Dense peer-to-peer interaction which fuels the process of self-organization. What we find then is that these members that interact more often and come to some form of consensus or coordination then form an attractor. Because they are now working together, they are now more effective than the other members in the organization, thus generating better results, which makes it more attractive for others to join that organization because they will get a greater reward from it. We now get a positive feedback loop, as the more people that join the organization, the more valuable it becomes for future prospective members to do likewise. This is the social network effect that is driven by positive feedback. It is behind the rapid expansion of many forms of organization, such as financial markets, where the more people there are in the market, the more liquidity, which reduces transaction costs, which attracts more traders, and so on. Another classical example would be the spread of English as a global language. Whereas previously we had many different societies speaking different languages, with the increase in global connectivity, it has become more valuable for us to have some common global language. Now that English has largely occupied that position, there is a positive feedback loop around it. The more people that learn it, the more valuable it becomes for others to learn. Even though only a small percentage of the global population speaks English natively, and even though there are other languages that are spoken natively by many more people, English will likely remain the global language because of its initial head start and this feedback loop that drives its development. The net result of this process is the emergence of some global pattern of coordination. A large section of our management paradigm is built up around the idea that the function of management is to get people to do what they would not spontaneously do. And this makes sense, because if people spontaneously did what you wanted them to do, then you obviously would not need management in this sense. So within this traditional paradigm, the idea of self-organization looks totally contradictory to the whole endeavor of management. It might be legitimate to ask then, do we need management if we have self-organization? The answer is of course yes, or there would be little point in this whole course. But management in this new context has to be redefined. As we've discussed, it's all about leading by creating or designing the future context. And this is where design thinking fits into management. We are designing the context instead of directly controlling or coordinating. David Snowden talks about managing self-organizing systems as being like managing your child's birthday party. One would take a very different approach to managing a child's birthday party as one would to managing a traditional organization. We would not specify the roles for each child that comes to the party, get them to clock in, set them deadlines for completing certain projects, and so on. The reason you don't do this is because you're not looking for a direct outcome to this organization. What we're hoping for is a self-organizing emergent outcome, where people interact, and out of that interaction we get the emergence of the children enjoying themselves, a child's party. But even though we're not trying to manage the system in a formal fashion, if we want the desired outcomes, we still need to organize the party. It's not going to happen at all otherwise. And what we're doing when we do that is creating the context that will induce the children to interact and self-organize. We put toys out, we make a little sports field out back where they can kick a ball around. We get a clown, some balloons, put some music on. All of these are creating the context. We create this context and put all these things out, but we don't tell the children which ones to play with. What we'll see is that attractors will spontaneously form around some of the things, and the children will be drawn into that for some time, and during that time we will get the emergence of the fun party that we hope for. And we can see from this how self-organization is a dynamic process. Another example of this approach to management would be Google giving their employees time off to work on projects of their own interest. Google isn't of course doing this out of the pure goodness of their heart, but of course hopes for some desired outcome, namely new innovations. But they know that the development of new ideas takes time and space. Like learning, it is a self-organizing process. New, different ideas have to be tested, interact and combined before some coherent, functional pattern may emerge. In order for Google's management to enable this, they have to create a space that engages people's self-motivation for the process to take place. They can then, later on, reap the benefits of what emerges out of this. In this video, we've been looking at the process of self-organization, a major theme within complex systems, where organization emerges out of local interactions. We firstly gave a little context to this discussion by talking about the rise of information technology as an enabler of peer-to-peer interactions that shifts the balance of power from traditional, centralized organizations to more informal, self-organizing systems. We then went on to give an overview to this process of self-organization, talking about the need for the members to have the autonomy to adapt to local events, the need for dense interactions, that will require them to find some form of coordination, and then how, out of this, we get the emergence of an attractor and global coordination driven by positive feedback. We lastly noted how the practice of organizational management has to fundamentally change when dealing with self-organizing systems, from specifying outcomes to designing the input context. The rise of networks and hyperconnectivity is one of the most radical and powerful forces shaping our world today. The advent of information technology and the internet has resulted in a massive reduction in collaboration costs and the possibility for people to set up their own networks of collaboration, giving presence to a mass of new networked organizations as they increasingly become the organizational structure of post-industrial economies. This new economy, driven by connectivity, is very different to the industrial economy. Instead of being about the familiar products and ownership paradigm that we're so used to, it's about services and access. This is the so-called access economy, also called the services economy or sharing economy. This economy is a business model where goods and services are traded on the basis of access rather than ownership. It refers to renting things temporarily rather than selling them permanently. As one person described it, the access economy is what emerges when access to X becomes cheap, satisfactory, convenient, and reliable enough that the premium on ownership of X disappears. So instead of owning your music on a CD, you have access to a music service that streams them. Or instead of owning movies, you have access to them on demand via an online streaming service. Instead of owning a car, you have access to transportation via a car-sharing service. And the list goes on, ever expanding as new businesses emerge with new access-based services to disrupt the existing product-based incumbents. This model uses technology platforms, often accessed via mobile devices, to connect suppliers willing to rent assets, for example apartments for rent or cars for transportation, with end users. This may reduce the need for intermediaries, for example organized businesses such as taxi companies, to intermediate between the supplier and consumer. Such platforms may also be used to connect employers and employees for employment opportunities, bypassing traditional employment service firms and traditional fixed employer-employee relationships. This wave of connectivity is having an effect on all organizations, as we see production processes, business processes in organizations get unbundled from their traditional monolithic form and distributed out into networks. The classical example of this is on-demand staffing services, platforms like Freelancer or Upwork, where people offer their skills in all forms of activity, from accounting to graphic design to business consulting, and you can create an organization on demand, hiring on a project basis, creating a very dynamic organization that can expand to meet capacity as employees join and leave the organization in a fluid fashion, making employees available to join multiple networks at the same time or over a period of time. Thus, employees become micro-entrepreneurs, broadcasting their availability, and organizations become networks for aggregating them in response to demand, which is a much more agile form of organization relative to our traditional model. The reduction in transaction cost has also enabled us to create new forms of organization that can harness the efforts of those at a much lower level of productivity than was previously possible. Traditional formal organizations with high overhead cost could only operate by ensuring their members achieved a certain level of productivity or professionalism, and this is part of what made them closed organizations. But when we reduce the transaction costs so low, then it becomes viable to create open organizations where everyone that is able to contribute anything is of value, and by getting enough people contributing only a small amount, we can create a large organization on the long tail. The mass of non-professionals that were previously not productive enough to be hired by formal organizations can now become prosumers, both producing and consuming. If we step out of our traditional paradigm surrounding work and formal organizations and look outside the box, we'll see quite quickly that we only utilize a small fraction of the actual productive resources available to us. We assume that formal organizations are the only effective means for value generation, so we use them to generate value either in the public or private sector. They are the systems that manage the various production processes within our society, and we assume tacitly that anyone that is not part of a formal organization is a passive consumer or amateur capable of only substandard production. It is a simple linear model that creates a dichotomy where formal organizations push out end products to passive recipients. You are either a professional producer or a consumer. Within many organizations, we have a dynamic where a few people have a vision as to how that organization should be, and then we have many people who are disenfranchised, simply executing on that vision like cogs in a machine. One commentator summarized the dynamic as such: at all levels, local, regional, national and global, we've created formal and quite rigid hierarchies for governance that pacifies us. We have become pieces, not players. A few people play, but the vast majority that can really make a difference are sitting on the benches watching the drama play out through the media. We don't feel like we participate. A lot of people are sitting inside of hierarchies, focusing on their tiny part and then going home, fall asleep, get up in the morning and do it all over again. Our strong talent and desire to contribute does not have a proper arena at work. We're not using the possibilities inside of our organizations. The result of this can be a semi-zombie organization, where very few people are in any way aware of or responsible for what is going on, while a very many are simply executing in a mechanical fashion the directions they're given. And this is a precarious and potentially dangerous situation when people become disenfranchised and resort to simply this centralized model. Of course, fails to capture or harness a vast amount of latent potential within society. That is the latent potential of people taking responsibility for their own lives and becoming engaged with the products they use and the maintenance of their environment. This is a vast new source of untapped potential value that we're just beginning to discover through user-generated content, co-creation, citizen engagement and so on. Formal organizations can only really tap into this by breaking out of the linear model. The idea that they have the right answer, they know what the consumer wants and they just have to give it to them. For example, this was essentially the model of the media industry until very recently. After many decades of producing blockbuster films and pop music, they thought they had the model perfected, producing big budget, perfectly finished productions and pushing them out to passive end users. And as long as we stay within the linear paradigm, it seems impossible to conceive of the end user wanting anything else. But of course, along came the internet and a whole new non-linear paradigm to media. It turns out what people really wanted was not just to consume perfectly finished products, but also to connect to each other, to share and create their own context and content. And in this way, we can see this whole new value proposition of simply connecting people on the long tail. And this applies to all areas from the energy industry to transportation to public administration. On its most fundamental level, connectivity is changing what people really want. From things to not only access, but really context. This is like what artists call the negative space, which is the space around a sculpture. It is everything except the object itself that gives the object context and is essentially how we interpret it. The access economy is about access, and when we sum up all those services we have access to, we get a context that is our quality of life. Once we have the basic material things needed for subsistence, people's values shift to wanting to be connected to the things they like. What we want is to feel connected with all the things we need and care about, whether that is our family, friends, transportation, public services, a nice clean environment or our local neighborhood. These things form the context to our lives and the quality of life. This is what the access economy is about. It's about people recognizing that a big pile of products was not really what they wanted, and it is becoming more clear that what they really wanted is access to services that create the context for the quality of life that they desire. As a producer, this is about networking all these products, simplifying the complex in delivering the seamless services that end users increasingly demand. In this video, we've been talking about networked organizations, how with the rise of connectivity, we're creating new forms of organizations within our economies, both on the institutional and the physical level. Institutionally, we're seeing the rise of networked organizations that harnesses the mass of people's productive capabilities through on-demand networks. On the physical level, networks are proliferating with the development of the services economy, where the function of products becomes virtualized and delivered as a service, which again can be aggregated through networks on demand in a world that is centered around the end user. With advanced economies having reached the end of the process of industrialization, we've witnessed the rise of new forms of highly complex challenges that have moved to the forefront of social concerns. Challenges such as climate change, inequality, environmental degradation, terrorism, global financial instability, multicultural integration, or cybersecurity. These are challenges of a qualitatively different kind to the core issues we faced during the process of industrialization. If we turn the clock back 100 years or 200 years, the kind of challenges we faced, although complicated, were much simpler in their nature. The challenge of building and coordinating the railroads, building the modern nation state, and the bureaucracy required to provide its public services efficiently. We had the challenge of building skyscrapers for the first time, of flying around the world, or landing someone on the moon. Today, we can manage complicated rail networks virtually anywhere in the world, like cutting out cookies. All these problems are certainly not simple, but they are of a different nature to a problem like escalating inequality, and it is these complex systemic challenges that are an essential part of our 21st century reality. In fact, we may note that many of these wicked problems can be understood to have derived from the set of solutions we developed during the industrial age. These industrial age systems of organization that were once great achievements have in many ways reached the end of their life cycle and were left with some of the limitations in their design. The combustion of fossil fuels that served us so well for centuries being a classical example. As Einstein would say, we can't solve problems by using the same kind of thinking we used when we created them. These wicked problems we face today require a new skill set and new, more collaborative systems of organization to try and tackle them. Wicked problems are highly complex problems. They are unstructured, open-ended, they are multidimensional, systemic, and may have no known solution. In many ways, we can think of wicked problems as essentially dysfunctionalities within a complex system. Where we have the complex system of the human body, we have the wicked problem of healthcare. Where we have advanced economies, we have the wicked problem of extreme inequality. And where we have the internet, we have cybercrime. In all of these cases, the problem cannot be isolated and separated from the system. These wicked problems are systemic in nature. They can be understood as an emergent phenomena of how the local components interact, of how the whole system works, and not simply one part of it, that can be isolated, tackled, and solved in a traditional linear fashion. The concept of a wicked problem first derives from social planning and political science. Horst Rittel and Melvin Weber formally described the concept of wicked problems back in the 1970s, contrasting them with relatively tame, solvable problems. So let's firstly talk about some of these tame problems. Examples of tame problems might be solving a jigsaw puzzle, finding the shortest route from A to B on a map, or repairing a computer. These standard problems share a number of features in common. Firstly, they have a clear boundary. There is a well-defined and stable problem statement that has a definitive stopping point, that is, when the solution is reached. It is relatively simple to say what is part of the problem and what is not. Next, there are a finite number of elements interacting, and given enough analysis, we can fully understand the system, the drivers in the system, and the causes and effects. Think about fixing a car. It may be complicated, but there is a manual somewhere where all of the parts and interactions within the car can be known. With these tame problems, there are a static problem. It does not change over time. Think of fixing a light bulb. The actual problem stays the same throughout the process. These tame problems can be standardized. That is to say, they belong to a class of similar problems, which can be solved in a similar way. And thus, over the course of the past few centuries, with the rise of modern science, we've developed a powerful and standardized set of methods within mathematics and engineering for solving tame problems, even when they're very complicated. Wicked problems are qualitatively different from tame problems, largely due to the fact that we're dealing with open systems instead of closed systems. Climate change is one of the best examples of a wicked problem, as is the challenge of global governance or multiculturalism. All of these challenges have a number of features that make them highly complex and non-amenable to our traditional approach, in which problems are defined, analyzed, and solved in sequential steps. Firstly, because we're dealing with open systems, they are often unbounded in space and time. They cross disciplines, borders, and departments, making them very difficult to structure. You will often hear the word messy used when people talk about wicked problems. They are also open in scope. The more you probe into the problem space, the more it expands into different dimensions. Unlike our tame problems, these wicked problems have no stopping rule. Terrorism, again, might be a good example of this. It slips through the fingers of powerful governments, and searching for its root cause will take you on an open-ended exploration of many different socio-cultural, political, and economic dimensions. Wicked problems are multi-dimensional. Not only are they interconnected on many scales from the micro to the macro, they are also composed of multiple different social, economic, technical, and environmental factors. There is no one standardized global solution that fits all. Coupled with this is the fact that these problems involve a strong cultural dimension. They are often deeply qualitative in nature, involving human values, deeply entrenched socio-political dynamics and vested interests. Again, climate change is a good example, as is systemic political deadlock. Next, these problems have many deep interconnections and interdependencies. The systems we're dealing with these wicked problems are intricately interconnected, interdependent, and non-linear. The problem of tackling poverty might be an example of this. It is strongly interconnected with many different areas, from economic inequality to racism to education to public services and so on. With these highly interconnected problems, when you try to pull on one part, you end up getting the whole thing. Lastly, complex problems are dynamic in nature. They evolve over time. Events are continuously changing. Problems and solutions are entwined as they co-evolve, with the definition of the problem itself also evolving. Coupled to this is the fact that the different components are often autonomous and adapting to their own incentives and local environment with limited centralized authority. The challenge of global governance is a good example of this, where authority to act still resides on the national level, and thus the international political environment is the product of continuously evolving local level interactions and adaptations. Overcoming this to find common global consensus and coordination is proving very difficult. In response to the intimidating nature of wicked problems, many people feel overwhelmed and respond with denial of the problem or resignation and determinism, resulting in inertia. Another typical response is to try to turn a complex problem into a simple one in a number of different ways, such as describing a related problem or sub-problem that you can solve and declare that that is the problem, or creating objective parameters by which to measure the solution success, with whatever is not measured being then free to absorb the real problem. That is to say, just shifting the problem from one place to another, which is very easy to do given the scale of these problems. Attempting to tame a wicked problem in this way, while appealing in the short run, will clearly fail in the long run. The wicked problem will reassert itself, perhaps in a different form, or worse, the tamed solution may exacerbate the problem and divert resources. truly tackling complex problems requires systems thinking to see the bigger picture and integrate the many different perspectives and domains to the problem. By seeing the system as a whole, we can get a real idea of the true nexus that makes up the core constraints at the heart of the problem. We need to gain a fundamental perspective that encapsulates the many diametrically opposed views and then work backwards to be able to contextualize the diverse perspectives on the problem. Wicked problems involve social complexity, and thus we need to develop a platform for building a common understanding of the problem. This means being able to communicate the complexity of the problem in a way that is accessible to all, creating a paradigm within which people can integrate their own context and meaning. Tackling these problems requires a strong infrastructure of trust and collaboration to overcome the need for a long-term sustained investment where there is a lack of short-term incentives. Analysis of the stakeholders and the power dynamics surrounding the situation are critical to successfully designing stakeholder collaboration. Empathy and active listening are required to be able to effectively map out the diverse set of views and opinions that need to be integrated. Finally, having created a platform for the co-creation of solutions, we need an iterative, experimental approach to developing the project due to the co-evolutionary nature of problems and solutions, and we'll talk about this further in the coming modules. In this section, we've been talking about wicked problems, highly complex problems that represent systemic failures within a complex system. We looked at some of the characteristics of tame problems that can be standardized, classified, and solved through routine procedures. We then went on to talk about some of the features to complex problems, including their open nature, their unstructured messiness, multidimensionality, their systemic roots, and lack of known solution, all of which requires a different, more collaborative approach to tackling them that involves harnessing qualitative values in order to get deep engagement, collaboration, and long-term commitment from diverse stakeholders. In 2009, the Project Management Institute (PMI) announced their Book of the Year as the publication entitled Managing Complex Projects: A New Model, declaring it a groundbreaking study of complex project management. In the preface to the book, the author writes, "It is now becoming clear that our conventional project management processes are inadequate when dealing with complex projects. Research is underway by the Project Management Institute and others to determine what makes projects complex and to learn how to manage project complexity. Many thought leaders in the field of project management are presenting alternative approaches to managing complex projects. We're now realizing that new approaches are desperately needed to manage complex projects in the ever-changing global economic environment." The book goes on to talk about how for organizations to survive and thrive in today's global economy, they must find ways to dramatically improve the performance of large-scale projects. It talks about how applying the concepts of complexity theory can complement conventional project management approaches and enable us to adapt to this new context of having to deliver large-scale, complex projects under uncertain and volatile conditions. A project is a temporary endeavor composed of a set of tasks that are coordinated into achieving a particular result. It is designed to execute on the organization's strategy. Tasks are integrated into processes to ensure the work is coordinated and completed within a given set of constraints such as time, quality, scope, budget, etc. Thus, projects have a set of boundaries that define them, and they take place within a particular environment. Like organizations, projects are systems. They can be simple, linear systems or complex systems. In this section, we're going to talk about the qualitative difference between the two, so as to understand why we need a fundamentally different approach to our traditional management methods when dealing with these complex projects. We'll start by talking about the nature of linear, standardized projects with some examples. Moving house is an example of a simple, standardized project. It is a relatively straightforward process. We know the current state of the system, our present house with all our things in it. We know the desired end result, the house we're moving into with all our things there. The environment within which our house-moving project will take place is relatively stable and predictable. Thus, the project simply consists of completing a very limited number of well-defined stages in a sequential order. There are, of course, many examples of more complicated projects. Building an airplane is a good example of a very complicated project. There are many parts, many instructions that need to be followed exactly, and many stages that need to be completed over a prolonged period of time. But although complicated, it is still a linear deterministic project. We know the starting state, the desired end state, and we can decompose the project into a clear set of sequential stages that follow a deterministic linear projection. So let's itemize the key features to these standardized projects so as to be clear about them. Firstly, we're dealing with a well-defined project. With these standardized projects, the statement of the work, the scope of the project, and its boundaries are reasonably well defined. We know where we are and we know where we want to go to. Secondly, the project can be decomposed into a set of parts. The project can be broken down into a set of stages, and these stages can be performed in isolation and then combined to produce the end result. Thirdly, the environment is relatively stable and predictable. The environment within which the project is taking place is relatively unchanging, and there are a limited number of elements interacting in a well-known linear fashion, making extreme events extremely unlikely. Finally, standardized procedures can be applied. We can use a project management methodology that has been developed and undergone continuous improvement after use on several previous projects. We're able to use best practices and lessons learned. We follow the well-defined life cycle phases, and we have forms, templates, checklists, and guidelines to assist us through each stage of the project. Much of our project management methods were developed during the industrial age to deal with projects of this nature, and have proven effective and scalable in delivering large-scale industrial projects, from building national power grids to landing people on the moon. The problem arises when we have to deal with more complex situations, which is increasingly the case. So let's start with an example of a complex project. One example of this might be trying to improve the standard of living within a particular disadvantaged area of a city. We're dealing with many diverse elements, from crime prevention to education to public services to infrastructure, social workers, and so on. Multiple stakeholders who have disparate opinions about the current state of the system and its desired future state. Added to this, the neighborhood represents a unique social, cultural, and economic mix that would reject any standardized procedure or process for altering it. The environment within which the project takes place may be dynamic and volatile. A financial crash may occur within the broader economy, or there may be major changes in the political regime. Lastly, we're dealing with the whole system. Optimizing any component in isolation would be of limited value in achieving our desired outcome. We would need to work across traditional boundaries, creating synergies to tackle interdisciplinary problems from different dimensions. So let's analyze this project a bit more to untangle what makes it truly complex instead of just complicated. To start with, we're not exactly sure where we are and where we're going to with the project. In complex projects, we do not have complete information and knowledge of the system we're dealing with. We may be starting the project with an ill-defined scope, thereby requiring numerous scope changes throughout the project, and consequentially having a moving target as an end point. In such a case, we have to take a step and then see where we are, what the goal now is, and then readjust before taking the next step. The outcomes to the project cannot be fully envisioned at the inception of the project and then simply delivered as planned, but constant adaptation is required. Secondly, these projects are often taking place within a complex and volatile environment. As with our example previously, complex projects are open to their environment, meaning they are interdependent on and embedded within larger systems. Projects may be subject to constant and volatile change. Change in technologies, change in business and market environments, change in organizational structure and policies, and change among the project's key stakeholders, and change in strategic directions, which are often outside the direct control of the project team. As we've seen in previous lectures, these complex environments are non-linear, meaning there is also a much higher likelihood of extreme events occurring. Thirdly, standardized procedures cannot be used. Complex projects are more like living organisms than machines, for which we can have instruction manuals. They have to evolve over time in response to the particular local conditions, and they may also go through phased transitions into new, unpredictable states. Lastly, complex projects cross traditional boundaries and deal with multiple, diverse stakeholders. There is often a complex social dynamic to large projects. Governance will appear in the hands of many rather than in the hands of few. Stakeholders may represent widely divergent political, cultural, and social values and beliefs. Within this environment, there is a strong need to create a context for common understanding of objectives. Communications and stakeholder analysis become central. In this section, we've looked at our traditional approach to project management that is designed for standardized, well-defined endeavors within predictable and stable environments. We've talked about the key features to complex projects, such as uncertainty in defining our objectives, meaning we have to take an adaptive, flexible approach, the changing environment within which they take place, and their holistic and interdisciplinary nature. As we've been talking about in past lectures, the rapid growth of globalization, information technology, and a changing environmental context are all working to take us into a much more complex world. This world is interconnected, interdependent, non-linear, and more volatile. Over the past few decades, an acronym has emerged within the business community to define the fundamental internal and external conditions that affect organizations within this complex environment. This acronym is called VUCA, and it stands for Volatility, Uncertainty, Complexity, and Ambiguity. The common usage of the term VUCA began about how to develop strategies for operating within this VUCA environment. So let's start by talking a bit about strategy and our traditional approach to it in a non-VUCA world. Strategic management involves the formulation and implementation of major goals and initiatives taken by an organization's top management based on an assessment of the internal and external environment within which the organization operates. Thus, how we approach strategy will obviously change in response to the environment within which our organization is operating. Owing to its origins within industrial age manufacturing, much of our modern management theory is focused upon relatively stable, predictable, routine environments where there is one relatively clear objective. These factors make possible an approach to strategy that is based around a few key concepts and methods. Firstly, there is one optimal goal or solution. Within these relatively static environments, where there is one clear defined metric for performance, such as maximizing revenue, there can be one right answer, one optimal solution, and thus the aim is to obtain all of the information required and perform analysis upon it in order to identify this optimal solution. The objective then is to guide the organization towards this desired outcome through the control of the elements within the organization. Secondly, fixed future projections. Due to limited volatility and the high level of predictability within the environment, we can project past experience and data onto the future and use risk-based analysis to calculate and ascribe quantitative payoffs to a limited number of future possibilities. Lastly, the use of progress planning. The progress towards our ultimate goal can be broken down into stages. We can create clear metrics for each stage, and the movement through these stages is typically a linear, incremental process. This approach to strategy works fine until we turn up the volatility, uncertainty, and complexity within the environment. Turning a rapidly changing external environment to our advantage requires a recalibration of many dimensions across how we develop, deploy, and deliver our strategy. And this is where complexity management finds its application, to offer us an alternative paradigm with which to lead organizations in these more complex environments. So let's take a quick look at the different dimensions to the VUCA world and responses complexity theory offers to this changing environment. Firstly, volatility. In systemically volatile environments, change is a constant, and our strategy needs to evolve from resisting it to working with it. This means creating organizations that are resilient through their agility and capacity for adaptation. The strategic emphasis shifts from creating fixed, well-defined goals and plans to trying to create agile organizations led by a clarity of vision and effective communications, so that it can be very clear about its values and objectives, but very flexible in how it implements capabilities and achieves that vision. Secondly, uncertainty. Uncertainty is the inability to know everything fully. This uncertainty is derived from the large number of elements within the system, their nonlinear interactions, and their capacity to adapt to local events as they evolve over time. This means that in these complex systems, the future emerges. The outcome of an emergent process cannot be known beforehand. Trying to compute the actual details and define a single future scenario is a lost endeavor. In environments where uncertainty is pervasive, our traditional risk-based analysis of the future breaks down. The only way to respond to this is to perform multiple simulations and experiments that will allow us to explore how things will really play out on the ground, and to maintain a diverse and complementary system that is capable of responding to a number of different possible environmental conditions. Next, complexity. When people talk about complexity within the VUCA framework, they're referring to interconnectivity and interdependence. The nonlinear interactions and interdependence within complex organizations renders our capacity for control over the system through direct interventions limited. In complex systems, we cannot always know what the outcome to our interventions will be due to these nonlinear interactions and interdependencies. Thus, our capacity to directly align the elements of the organization towards some desired future goal is very much limited. The main response to this is for a leader to focus on creating the context that enables solutions to emerge in response to the changing environment. Lastly, ambiguity. Ambiguity is the quality of being open to more than one interpretation. When environments become complex, simple, linear, cause and effect descriptions of events break down, and ambiguity arises due to this lack of models to explain the observed phenomena. Resolving ambiguity means understanding the context within which events take place. It requires systems thinking to see the interconnections, to gain different perspectives in order to build up the full context within which an event can be properly understood. In this video, we've taken a brief introduction to the VUCA world. We've looked at our traditional approach to strategy within stable environments, and a brief overview to how this needs to change when dealing with more complex environments. And we'll spend more time in the coming modules exploring each of these different dimensions to the VUCA world in greater depth.